Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Anna Zawicka-Łojek, and on behalf of the Department of European Law, the Students' Association of European Law and Alumni Association of our faculty, I would like to welcome our distinguished guest, Ms. Emily O'Reilly, who has been the European Ombudsman since 2013, and previously for 10 years, the Irish Ombudsman. Before taking up the Ombudsman office, Ms. O'Reilly had a distinguished career as an author, journalist, and political editor. Mrs. O'Reilly's career has attracted significant domestic and international recognition, including a Harvard Fellowship, honorary doctorates, multiple awards, including the award for the women who, being on the list of women who shape Brussels. She has been promoting human rights throughout her career, and today she will tell us about the role of the European Ombudsman in protecting fundamental rights, getting transparency for European citizens in these difficult times we live in. Ms. O'Reilly, please take the floor.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction. It's beautiful to be here. I'd forgotten how lovely Warsaw is, especially in the sunshine. This is not what I was expecting towards the end of September, but it's very welcome, so it's lovely to be here. So I thank the students, alumni, and faculty of the Department of Law and Administration for the invitation to speak to you today on the topic of the European Ombudsman in a geopolitical age, protecting fundamental rights and accountability. And Warsaw is the most appropriate venue for a meditation on geopolitical thinking, given that Poland is at the epicenter of the geopolitical earthquake unleashed by Putin's invasion of Ukraine last year. And as so many decisions that you are now making for yourselves are necessarily informed by geopolitics. But before I speak on the core of today's topic, I want to explain a few things about my role. The first is that as Ombudsman, I act completely independently. I am elected by the European Parliament with no involvement either of the Member States or of the Commission. I first went forward for election in 2013 on the basis of my 10 years as Ireland's independent Ombudsman and Freedom of Information Commissioner, and I've never been a member or a public supporter of any political party or grouping. The European treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights provide for the right of all EU citizens to good administration, and the European Ombudsman is charged with enabling that right and the broader principles of good administration. So I deal with individual complaints against the EU administration from citizens, from business organisations, from media, from civil society, and even occasionally from parliamentarians. My mandate covers the entire EU administration, apart from the European Parliament in its political role and the European Court of Justice in its judicial role. In other words, I don't inquire into the political actions of MEPs or the rulings of the court. The range of complaints I do deal with is nonetheless vast, from access to documents requests, EU law infringement issues, the transparency of clinical trials on medicines, conflict of interest cases involving EU officials, disputes over the awarding of EU grants, tenders and contracts, the transparency of trade deals between the EU and other countries, revolving door cases when EU officials move from the public to the private sector, alleged failures to comply with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, disputes involving staff of the EU administration, among many more. I have the right to inspect whatever document is necessary to deal with a case, and I also use my power of own initiative to inquire into systemic problems in the EU administration, even if I have not received a direct complaint about them. Just last week, for example, I laid a special report before the European Parliament following an investigation into European Commission delays in dealing with access to documents cases, and particularly in cases of high public interest. Recent examples show that it took the Commission over a year to deal with requests concerning documents relating to migration, to EU recovery funds, and to sanctions against Russia. My concern is that these delays undermine citizens' ability to scrutinise EU decisions and policies in a direct and a timely way. My decisions are not binding, but in the vast majority of cases they are accepted either fully, partially, or eventually. So my primary reason, however, for coming to Warsaw at this time is to visit the headquarters of the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, Frontex, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and discuss with the Executive Director and his team the issues that are raised by citizens and others about that agency. We receive many public access request cases concerning Frontex when the agency has refused to release certain documents, in addition to complaints concerning its fundamental rights role. We have also conducted a number of own initiative investigations into Frontex, and we are currently inquiring into its role in search and rescue, including in connection with the tragic drowning of hundreds of migrants when their boat sank in Greek waters last June. As that inquiry is ongoing and as we await Frontex replies, I'm not in a position yet to say too much about it. But when you look at the issues I deal with, document access cases in relation to Russian sanctions, for example, or in relation to international trade deals, or on an own initiative basis, our inquiry into conflict of interest checks on those involved in evaluating project proposals for the European Defence Fund, you can see how the EU's geopolitical thinking and activities and actions necessarily impacts on our work. The challenge for my office, or indeed for any ombudsman or independent oversight office, is in decoupling, disentangling the politics, which is none of our business, from the administration, which is, and which encompasses the fundamental values that should guide good government: trust, transparency, and fundamental rights. So in my address to you this morning, I want to explore two main issues. One concerns the EU Commission's positioning and description of itself in the midst of significant global disruption, change and challenge. That is, its evolution from a simple commission under former Commission President Barroso just 10 years ago to becoming a self-styled, very political commission under former Commission President Juncker, before morphing into the Geopolitical Commission, as the current Commission President von der Leyen has described her Commission since 2019. And the second issue is migration, a subject reaching yet another peak of political concern in the last few weeks, as you're all aware, and specifically how the EU balances those political challenges with its obligations under the treaties and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. It is an issue that encapsulates the nature of the tensions inherent in geopolitics. My office, as I've said, cannot concern itself with the politics, but we cannot either not concern ourselves with the fundamental rights issues that arise, and which do not disappear from EU law once the geopolitical tension rises vis-à-vis migration and other issues with an external dimension. So in preparing for my visit this week to Warsaw, I remember the first time I came here in April 2014, just weeks after Russia had invaded and subsequently annexed the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. I recall being struck by how many Polish people told me of their concerns about Russian aggression more generally. They voiced their fears with a rhetoric that at that time did not find a strong echo in Brussels. In July of that same year, in a speech delivered to the European Parliament by the then candidate for the European Commission presidency, Jean-Claude Juncker, Russia was not explicitly mentioned at all, while Ukraine received just two very brief mentions. The following year, in his first State of the European Union address, Commission President Juncker did speak of EU sanctions against Russia, warned about the inviolability of EU borders, and recalled the then recent G20 summit in Brisbane, when he'd had a lengthy conversation with Russian President Putin, recalling, said Juncker, how long they had known each other, but how different times had become. Juncker's 2015 speech was, however, primarily focused not on Russia, but on the migration crisis, which was then reaching a peak. And in words that would not find quite the same echo in the Brussels of 2023, Juncker said, quote, "This is first of all a matter of humanity and of human dignity. And for Europe, it is also a matter of historical fairness. Our common history is marked by millions of Europeans fleeing from religious or political persecution, from war, dictatorship, or oppression. Huguenots fleeing from France in the 17th century, Jews, Sinti, Roma, and many others fleeing from Germany during the Nazi horror of the 1930s and 40s. Spanish Republicans fleeing to refugee camps in southern France at the end of the 1930s after their defeat in the Civil War. Hungarian revolutionaries fleeing to Austria after their uprising against communist rule was oppressed by Soviet tanks in 1956. Czech and Slovak citizens seeking exile in other European countries after the oppression of the Prague Spring in 1968. Have we forgotten, Juncker added, that 20 million people of Polish ancestry live outside Poland as a result of political and economic emigration after the many border shifts, forced expulsions and resettlements during Poland's often painful history? We Europeans should know and should never forget why giving refuge and complying with the fundamental rights to asylum is so important. And he concluded, we can build walls, we can build fences, but imagine for a second if it were you, your child in your arms, the world you knew, torn apart around you. There is no price you would not pay. There is no wall you would not climb, no sea you would not sail, no border you would not cross, if it is war or the barbarism of the so-called Islamic State that you are fleeing. End of quotation. So let's now move to the present day, almost a decade since the invasion of Crimea and the last peak of the migrant crisis. Three main events: the 2016 election of Donald Trump as US President, the COVID pandemic of 2020, and Russia's war on Ukraine in 2022, became instrumental in shifting the EU focus in a more explicitly geopolitical direction, and most noticeably, as I've said, in the shift from Commission to Geopolitical Commission. The increasing trade and technological global power and reach of China has also played a major role. Now, this shift wasn't entirely new, but the very deliberate naming of that shift, the very explicit signalling of EU intent concerning its global interaction was. The European Commission has always floated, as Juncker's former chef de cabinet Martin Selmayr has said, between different poles of nature. Sometimes, and that depends a lot on the historical circumstances, he added, it goes more towards its technocratic pole, and sometimes it moves towards its political pole. The historical circumstances of recent years have clearly shifted the Commission towards its political pole. The current Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, describes her Commission as geopolitical and organises its work with a view to the strategic instrumentalisation of EU soft and hard power globally in order to achieve what the Commission calls strategic autonomy. The aim is to protect the EU to the greatest extent possible from the fallout of shifting global alliances and global trade competition, particularly in the area of new technologies. And of course, the move towards greater EU defence autonomy has also been accelerated by the war. That shift was visible across every page of her State of the European Union address to Parliament 2 weeks ago. From Chinese trade wars to Russian aggression to Europe's defence and technological capacities, the geopolitical overlay was there. On migration, there was no trace of Juncker's emotive and emotional plea for human understanding of some years ago. Rather, the issue was couched in a few brief paragraphs as primarily one of people smuggling and human trafficking. Political priorities, and with them, political rhetoric, had both changed. The challenge this poses for my office as European Ombudsman has also come into sharper focus. Ombudsmen do not, as I said earlier, typically stray into the arena of politics. But when a body such as the Commission moves more towards its political pole, how does an ombudsman navigate that intersection? As European Ombudsman, my office naturally pays great attention to what the Commission does as the vast majority of complaints we receive are against that institution, and for obvious reasons, given its role and its huge interface with citizens. Accountability is relatively straightforward when one is dealing with matters that the Commission itself largely administers, issues around grants, contracts, infringement proceedings, access to documents, among others. But when it comes to matters involving many different actors, both inside and outside the EU, like migration deals with third countries, the distribution of the recovery and resilience funds to member states, decision-making concerning defence procurement, or the purchase of COVID vaccines, matters become slightly more challenging. The recent agreement that the EU concluded with Tunisia is a good example of how a speedy response to an urgent political challenge can complicate the business of holding the institutions to account. Jointly announced in Tunis earlier this year by the Commission President and the Tunisian President Sayed, and in the company of two member state prime ministers, Italy's Giorgia Meloni and the Netherlands' Mark Rutte, the deal included commitments from the Tunisian government to stem the flow of migrants from its coast to European destinations across the Mediterranean. In return, Tunisia will receive funding from the Commission to help manage these migration flows, as well as funding from the Commission and Member States to stabilise its struggling economy, to create new energy partnerships, and much else. Described as an achievement of Team Europe in press releases and public statements, questions were asked by some MEPs as to what Team Europe was exactly and to whom it was accountable. Some EU Foreign Affairs ministers also expressed their concerns in writing to the Commission about the lack of formal consultation. Questions then emerged about the fundamental rights element of the deal and whether they had been fully explored in advance. As I've already noted, the politics of the deal are not my concern, but I have opened an inquiry into the measures that the Commission has taken or will take in order to ensure that the fundamental rights of migrants transiting through the Tunisian border will not be undermined as a result of this deal. The primary mandate of the European Ombudsman is to identify and remedy maladministration in the European institutions, bodies and agencies. Good administration encompasses observance of and respect for fundamental rights. And where fundamental rights are not respected, there cannot be good administration. This is a point that I've emphasised in many other similar inquiries, including into the role of fundamental rights in international trade agreements and in the migration deal between the EU and Turkey in 2016. In relation to that deal, I concluded that there should be a prior and explicit evaluation of the human rights impact of relevant policies and actions, ideally before these actions start and policies are adopted, for obvious reasons. So my current inquiry will look into whether these considerations have been reflected in the thinking that shaped the Tunisia deal. Both the Turkey and Tunisia agreements share some common elements. Most obviously, they both respond to the perception that irregular migration is now out of control. They also both involve deals with countries with poor human rights records. But they also speak to the idea that some events require a rapid political intervention or resolution that justifies or even requires the abandonment of normal decision-making processes and the full measure of accountability that comes with that. This idea has been explored in depth in the work of Luc van Middelaar, the political scientist and former advisor to a former president of the European Council. Middelaar distinguishes between the politics of rules and the politics of events. The politics of rules is the core business of what he calls the Brussels rule-making factory, a mechanism that produces consensus and results, and where officials are charged with the implementation of the rules. That is their domain. The politics of events, by contrast, requires politicians who can improvise, who can get political opinion on their side, who display initiative, courage, and incisiveness, as he said, at just the right moment. For him, for von Middelaar, this kind of politics is exemplified by the actions, say, of an Angela Merkel or a Mario Draghi at the height of the Euro crisis, or a Nicolas Sarkozy in negotiating a ceasefire between Georgia and Russia in 2008. They are virtues, he implies, that are too rarely on display on the European stage, and that the quality of the EU and its politics is diminished as a result. And he is right, that there are indeed times when, confronted with unprecedented events, citizens demand and expect political leadership to deal with them. The Ukraine war and the COVID-19 pandemic are good examples of politicians at European level who, after a few missteps, rose to the moment in the way that Middle-hour urges. But where is that line to be drawn between the politics of rules and the politics of events? Improvisation on the geopolitical stage is an inherent necessary element of that interaction, but we need to be aware also of its potential dangers, and in particular for the quality of government. Firstly, by leaving behind the constraints of rules and process, there is a risk that we also abandon moral or ethical constraints. What matters is getting the desired result, and to be seen to be getting the desired result quickly and decisively. Viewed through this lens, geopolitics risks the deprioritizing of values. As I concluded in my decision on the EU-Turkey deal, the human rights elements should not be viewed as an optional addition to political deal-making. A human rights impact assessment, after all, is not simply a box to be ticked as part of routine decision-making. Done properly, it is a tool that allows for a measured and thoughtful analysis of risks posed to the fundamental rights of everyone affected by a policy and what might be done to mitigate them. If we think of the confrontation between democracies and autocracies as the defining fault line of our geopolitical age, as President von der Leyen indicated in her State of the Union address last year, such an assessment should be at the core of all our foreign policy initiatives. Nearly 40 years ago, a famous alumnus at this university, the philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, warned against this impulse in a lecture entitled The Idolatry of Politics. He was a prominent critic of the communist regime, and he was writing at the time when the fall of the Berlin Wall was unimaginable and when fundamental rights were considered part of a dangerous ideology. And he wrote, "I believe it important to keep in mind that personal rights set limits on democratic principles rather than being their natural consequence. And personal rights have to be vindicated on moral grounds, much as their implementation depends on political conditions. In a world where everything has become politicized, it does matter to repeat the time-honored truism that political goals have to be assessed in terms which are not political." End of quote. Secondly, in the arena of geopolitics, there is also a risk that we mirror the mindsets of our perceived adversaries, which may be considerably less attached to fundamental values and personal rights. This engagement can condition our political responses in ways that steer us away unnecessarily from our own fundamental values. And throughout my mandate as Ombudsman over the last 10 years, I have noticed that change in our political sensitivities. For example, in the contrast in the EU's response to 2 mass drownings in the Mediterranean that took place exactly 10 years apart. In 2013, following the deaths of more than 360 migrants off the island of Lampedusa in Italy, the then Commission President Barroso and the Home Affairs Commissioner Cecilia Malmström joined Prime Minister Letta of Italy to witness the terrible scenes in the aftermath of the shipwreck and to meet with survivors at the reception centres. In a press conference on the island given at the end of his visit, Barroso said, "I really appreciate the fact that I was coming here, because one thing is to read the reports, another thing is to watch the television, and another thing is to be in loco, in place, experiencing the suffering of the people. That image of hundreds of coffins will never get out of my mind. It is something I think one cannot forget. I also saw the desperate eyes in many survivors. I saw in them some hope, and I believe now we have to give reason for that hope, to show that that hope, in the middle of this suffering, can be justified." Close quotes. But contrast these sentiments to the response in the aftermath of the shipwreck of the Adriana in June this year off the coast of Greece, with the loss of over 500 lives, many of whose bodies have never been recovered. Despite the international outrage, the incident received a much more muted response at European level. President von der Leyen made her own journey to Lampedusa this month, responding to a request from Italian Prime Minister Meloni to see for herself the large numbers of migrants who had recently made their way to its shores, all unharmed, apart from one newborn child who died shortly after birth as her mother made her way in a small boat across the Mediterranean. The primary message this time was not one of deep concern for those who had found sanctuary on the island, although of course their plight was recognised, but rather a renewed commitment to deal with migrant smuggling and to re-emphasise the importance the Commission placed on the Tunisia Agreement. Last July, as I mentioned earlier, my office also opened an inquiry into the role and responsibilities of Frontex when it comes to dealing with these matters. It is important, in the face of terrible human suffering, that institutions at all levels, national and European, reflect on their responsibilities and act accordingly. At the very least, and I recognise the challenges, it is important to be honest about those challenges and their implications, whether negative or positive, of proposed solutions. It is neither right nor wise to hide from public gaze the potential outcome of what they, the public, are implicitly being asked to endorse. The emphasis on geopolitical antagonisms also risks making us fearful and anxious, constantly looking for the next threat, and, given the actualised threats of the last few years, those fears are understandable. But where is the line between rational fear and fear deliberately created? Kolakowski, in an essay entitled The Death of Gods, wrote about the myths propagated by the powerful to keep hold of power. The first is the myth of the fortress under siege. In the besieged fortress, he writes, there is only one goal: to withstand the siege. And whatever furthers this goal is a good thing. In the besieged fortress, every dispute, every conflict is catastrophic. Every sign of weakness is a triumph for the enemy. The sense of being under siege requires the besieged to perceive the whole visible world outside the fortress as the enemy, preventing them from swelling their ranks and so strengthening their forces and cutting them off from all values and possibilities that lie outside. End of quote. We see elements of this at certain levels of decision-making in the European Union. It is there, perhaps, in the emphasis on hard infrastructure and surveillance equipment provided to member states and to Frontex in the name of securing our borders and building, in effect, what's sometimes called Fortress Europe. It was there briefly in 2019 when it was proposed to give one EU commissioner the title Commissioner for Protecting the European Way of Life. Following criticism, this was changed to Promoting the European Way of Life. A subtle but important difference. The final and perhaps most important challenge inherent in this geopolitical framing is the temptation to make crisis decision-making the new normal. The Tunisian agreement is once again a good illustration. If that template remains, it means in effect that the externalisation of the EU's border management has become settled migration policy, business as usual, as opposed to one-off crisis management. It's also worth noting that the use of the emergency decision-making powers that the Commission and the EU Council have acquired recently also feeds into the conversation around rapid geopolitical decision-making and accountability. In recent years, we have seen significant use of the crisis article in the EU Treaty, Article 122, which allows the EU Council, at the request of the Commission, to act through qualified majority in cases of severe difficulties caused by natural disasters or exceptional occurrences beyond its control. The European Parliament is simply informed of the measures proposed. Rarely used since the Treaty of Lisbon came into effect, it has been employed several times since 2020 as part of the legal basis for EU support for the short-term work programme SURE, its post-pandemic recovery fund, the joint vaccine procurement, joint gas purchases, and for an EU regulation on an emergency intervention to address high energy prices by imposing windfall taxes on energy companies. So while these initiatives were welcome, given the potential suffering that citizens may have experienced in their absence, all were approved in lightning-fast procedures, bypassing the European Parliament while receiving limited scrutiny from national parliaments. Nonetheless, one of the ways in which accountability can be achieved by citizens, even in these circumstances, is through the EU's Access to Documents regulation, which takes a generally liberal approach to transparency in line with the EU treaties, while also allowing for a few mandatory exemptions for certain classes of documents. One of these exemptions concerns the need to protect the public interest as regards international relations. But in recent times, my office has seen on many occasions how this exemption has been, in our view, misapplied to requests for documents ranging from negotiations on energy policy with the US, to EU sanctions imposed on Russia, to the transfer of citizens' data outside the borders of the EU. And common to those cases is the assumption that the mere fact that these processes involve third country governments is enough to justify invoking the exemption, regardless of the likely impact on EU citizens. And the number of inquiries opened by my office into the use of the exemption concerning international relations has grown considerably in recent years, from just one case in 2016 to 11 last year. It is obvious that the range of activity of this Geopolitical Commission is likely to increase in the years to come, as the external dimensions of our climate, digital and industrial policies become even more challenging, alongside the impact of possible enlargement and the war in Ukraine. My concern is that as more and more of the core business of the Commission and other institutions becomes internationalised, the more it may move beyond the full reach of the accountability measures embedded in ordinary rules and procedures and of watchdog institutions such as the Ombudsman. Exemptions for emergency measures and the demands of international relations may become increasingly normalised in order to be more politically agile in a fast-moving global order. But that at least allows us more clearly to evaluate the role of the European Ombudsman in a geopolitical age. As a soft power institution within the EU ecosystem, we cannot resolve or settle any of those tensions I referred to earlier, the tensions between the Commission's political or geopolitical and technocratic poles, between politics as rules and politics as events. These tensions will always be present in any system of governance at any level. Our role, rather, is, through our complaints and investigations, to guard and warn against the abuses and excesses of the system and to remedy them when we can. Excuse me. When it comes to the kind of decision-making inspired by geopolitical thinking, our role must be to remind the institutions that the values of trust, transparency, accountability, and fundamental rights are the pole stars that should light the way. While there is, of course, a role for decisive and even disruptive political action, it must lead back as quickly as possible to the arena of public discussion, public scrutiny, and public accountability. This is a task that we cannot perform alone, but only with like-minded institutions and citizens across the continent. Our task as Europeans should be to recover that ethical posture, that soft power that allows us to project ourselves confidently on a global stage rather than defensively. It means paying attention to that small, still voice that reminds us of our fundamental interdependence and of our obligations to others. That is the origin of those values articulated in Article 2 of the EU Treaty that represent the better angels of our nature. This is the Europe that has inspired and been admired by people and by movements all over the world. This is a Europe and a geopolitics worth fighting for. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your interesting and enlightening speech. I've been thinking, you've talked a lot about migration. I've been thinking during your whole speech how privileged we are to be Europeans, to be born in Europe. And the other thing I will remember is your sentence that it's important to be honest. And it's very difficult to be honest when you have to be neutral as well, when you have to be sort of independent. So thank you very much. And now I will give the role of the masters of the ceremonies to my students from the Students' Association. And the audience will have a chance to make comments and ask questions our guests. So thank you.
Mrs. Ombudsman, it's been an honor to been able to hear your valuable and meaningful speech for all of us. On behalf of the European Law Students Association, I can say that we were delighted to hear your speech. And now, in these times, as you said, of the geopolitical age, which is tough, which has and gives us a lot of concerns with many crises, many issues, we'd like to ask you a few questions. First, me and my colleague, and later we'll give the floor to our whole public and audience so they can ask their own questions too.
Ms. Ombudsman, thank you very much for your dedication and pursuit of truth and transparency in the EU. And now I would like to proceed with the first question, which is how often is it the case that you have to intervene because the applicant had no effective remedy in home country?
Well, obviously, the mandate of the European Ombudsman is limited to the European institutions. So somebody who makes a complaint, it has to be against one of the European institutions, agencies and bodies. But we do get what we call outside the mandate complaints, but we try and assist everybody who comes to us. So what we do is, if we get a complaint that we can't deal with it, we always direct somebody to where it might be dealt with. So that could be to the Ombudsman, for example, here, or some other agency that might be able to help it. We get several thousand complaints every year. We open around about 400 inquiries. They include own initiative investigations. So we do get a lot of complaints from Poland, not all of them within the mandate, obviously. One that we have seen recently concerns the situation in the prisons in Poland, which I gather has been an issue for a number of reasons. So when we get that complaint, we would send it back to the Ombudsman in whose jurisdiction it is, you know. So the complaints change depending on the politics, what's happening in people's lives and people's political systems. And that's why I said that we've quite an increase in the number of access to documents requests, which could broadly be seen to be in the arena of geopolitics, you know. And I think particularly since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, because obviously, you know, the EU has mobilized itself in all sorts of ways and people want to know, you know, what's happening, why it's happening and where the accountability is. So whereas we might have been getting, you know, complaints about certain infringement cases a few years ago, now increasingly we're getting complaints in the sort of areas that we're dealing with. But could I just say that when you have an issue, and I'm sure that you found this in your own lives, if you're trying to get something through, you tend to need a coalition of forces to get it through. So even though my reasoning in certain cases might, in my view, in our view, be absolutely correct and so on, if it's a sensitive issue, you do need a coalition of support around you. You tend to need maybe perhaps political champions in the European Parliament. You need airing in the media. You need civil society engagement. And it's only when you get that you can really push something through. That's why, you know, speaking to at venues like this and getting the word out in relation to the work that we do and spreading the word about what we do, and also the need for engagement with others in helping us to get certain difficult issues across the line, as we say, is so important.
Okay, you've mentioned that you need the whole coalition of people around you when to you have to you have an issue to overcome, and I'd like to ask you, how do you collaborate with maybe other ombudsmans around the world, maybe those from the EU countries, differently than only just sending the issue to them when it's like you said about the Polish prisons? What are the other forms of your collaboration as an EU ombudsman?
Well, I have the privilege of chairing the European network of ombudsmen. We meet in Brussels once a year. We will be meeting in November in the European Parliament, and we will be discussing issues including artificial intelligence, which is, obviously hugely important, and particularly in the area of public administration, when you think the applications that could be that artificial intelligence could be used for, and the accountability gaps that might arise there. We'll also be dealing with the issue of migration. So that's one way in which we engage, but we also have a process whereby, let's say, the Polish ombudsman has an issue with a particular EU element to it. Then he can send us a query, an inquiry. We can answer it perhaps ourselves, or we can, ask the Commission for a response. And they can also reach out to other colleagues in the network with various issues that we've dealt with. So that is the principal way that we communicate. We try to bring, I suppose, Brussels and that European piece to the member state ombudsman, and then we in turn learn from them about the issues that are emerging in their own country, so we can reflect that back as well to the European institutions.
All right, so perhaps as a follow-up to the question of migration, which you've talked about, and also of the public accountability of European administration, I wanted to ask about the EU-Tunisian agreement, because you've sent an inquiry to the European Commission, whether you received any response about that, about the human rights protection in Tunisia. And also, if you could perhaps comment on the Polish-Belarusian crisis border, the migration crisis, which has recently sparked a lot of controversies in Poland because of the premiere of Agnieszka Holland's movie Green Border.
Okay, well, as I said, in relation to the EU-Tunisia deal, that is essentially a political deal. It was signed by Madame von der Leyen, and she was accompanied by two member state prime ministers, Mark Rutte, whose government subsequently fell, partly over issues around migration, and who's now stepped down as prime minister, and Giorgia Meloni. And of course, Madame Meloni has been very much in the news recently because of Lampedusa and because of her calls. I think she called for a naval blockade in the Mediterranean. So you can see that there was a political, the choice of prime ministers to be there was a political choice. But as I said, that's not our business. But what is our business is that the EU, as I said, the laws don't change just because new political tensions arise, just because new political realities emerge. And we basically have a very easy job to do, a very easy job, but a very straightforward job to do, is to try and make sure that the institutions do what they're supposed to do. And part of what they are supposed to do is to protect the fundamental rights of people in accordance with the treaties and in accordance with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And that might not be always convenient at certain points, because perhaps sometimes if they were to do an agreement with a particular state, and if the result of a human rights impact assessment was that people would not be particularly safe in that country, then that deal might not be able to go ahead. So you can see, the issues there. I am most definitely not going to talk about the internal politics of Poland, but I did meet the deputy Polish ombudsman yesterday, and we discussed some of those issues. I mean, where the EU or where we would come in would be, obviously I don't have nothing to do with the member states whatsoever. But where we might conceivably come in a case where somebody had made an allegation of an infringement of EU law to the Commission, we wouldn't look at the allegation per se, the rights and wrongs of it, but if the Commission didn't act and the complainant was, wondering about that or made a complaint about that, then we could ask the Commission why it hadn't acted, when it was going to act, and also to give to the complainant its reasoning as to why it's acted. So the way we sort of get involved at some level in member state issues is only through another institution, such as the Commission, for example, or Frontex.
It will be the last question from us too, and then we'll give the floor to our audience. But I'd like to ask you, because migration is one topic, and Tunisian agreements, the Belarusian and Polish border are, of course, the issues. But nowadays, the geopolitical situation arises in different regions of the world, and recently we have a conflict in Mountain Karabakh in the border of Azerbaijan and Armenia, and we'd like to know what the EU can do according to this conflict there, how EU can help, how you as an European Ombudsman are going on what you've already done to help Armenian people.
Well, I don't see an immediate or particular role for my office, obviously. I mean, like all of us, we'll watch and see what the EU does. I'm sure that their diplomats will be, discussing this and seeing how they can act and all of that, and probably, discussing with their global partners as well. But in relation to anything that this office could do at this stage, no.
Okay, thank you so much. And now, all of you who have questions, please raise your hands. We'll see how many of you are. And my colleagues will come to you with the microphone.
Okay, due to the current situation, I would like to ask you two questions about the Polish visa scandal, which is taking place recently, and about its aftermath, which we will face in the future. So, first of all, what will the situation be like, including the issue with the migrants who illegally enter the territory of the European Union, binding human rights? Secondly, what steps can the Union take to normalize the situation? Thank you.
Yes, it's a good expression, normalizing the situation. I don't think any of us know what that would look like. I mean, we see what a complicated issue it is, and of course it's only going to get worse. I mean, if you read the risk assessment that Frontex did, I think about a year ago, where the migration flows are going to come from, and more particularly what's causing them, then these are not simple matters. And of course, one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face over the next few decades, if not sooner, is migration flows caused by the climate crisis. And that may be internal to the EU as well, because already places are becoming pretty unlivable in, and we've all experienced the summer recently. I mean, I'm from Ireland, you live in Poland. We're not used to this kind of weather at this time of the year, certainly, and while it's very nice, it's also a bit scary in certain ways. So, and there's an irony as well, because sometimes the people who are most opposed to regulations which will attempt to deal with climate change are also the ones who are also trying to, regulate migration in a particular way, and they don't see the connection between the two, or they refuse to see the connection between the two. So I don't think the EU on its own or any particular institution has the answer to this. This definitively needs a global response. And it also, in the context of the EU, means a much more generous response from the member states who are not on the Med or on the external borders, because the vast majority of EU countries have taken very, very few people, and that would include my own. Lots of Ukrainians, yes, wonderful, and of course, the moral issues around, well, why not other people? But I think, when I talked about the honesty of politicians, there's our honesty in relation to these and other matters. Politicians too often deal in short-termism. What's going to win me this election? What's going to get me elected again? Blah, 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 blah. And yet I think increasingly we're all having to be focused on a much medium to longer term view. And those are the politicians, I imagine, that should be supported. But the EU's difficulty is that it puts itself out there. It has always put itself out there on the global stage as a union of values. It's in our treaties, the rule of law and human rights and fundamental rights and all of that. And yet when it's trying to deal with the migration crisis and other crises, it just wants those to get out of the way. And that's why our role, and the role of others, is to make sure that they put their eyes back on that part. Because if they don't do that, then, you know, the medium to long-term impact is that they're going to lose credibility and they're going to lose their moral authority in the world. And that sounds very sort of whatever, pious. But moral authority is important. If you're trying to get states to act in a certain way and you're not acting that way yourself, then problems arise. Because if the EU is not seen to be acting well in relation to migrants and so on, in relation to their fundamental rights, then individual member states can point to the institutions and say, you're lecturing us, but you're doing this. And that's why I'm sure the investigations that we're doing at some level are very annoying for the institutions, but that's our job, you know, to constantly remind them, appreciate the tension that there is there and the political pressures and all of that, but to remind them that, as I said in my lecture, in my speech, the law hasn't changed. The fundamental values of the law, of the treaties have not changed. The Charter of Fundamental Rights has not been revised simply because political tensions arise in relation to migration. But, you know, this has to be solved in a global way because the migration flows are going to be huge and no number of, you know, Frontex border guards are going to be able to stop that.
Thank you so much for your answer. And now maybe someone from the closer here, maybe this.
Good morning. I would like to ask you a question concerning the ways of mitigating the deterioration of the rules-based order we see now in the European Union. Here in Poland, we have quite an experience with the deterioration of the rules-based order, and what was important in making it, in increasing public awareness of that problem were public statements and public involvement of the members of the judiciary in the media, making statements regarding the changes, the legislative processes, and so on and so forth. Do you think, and I'm asking it in the context of your decision concerning statements made by Advocate General Pitrucella, if I recall correctly, in the context of the Digital Markets Act last year, do you think that this is the way for the European Union to increase the awareness of the general public of that problem, or rather members of the judiciary should restrain themselves from making public comments? Thank you very much.
I do remember I think there was also members of the judiciary of other countries joined in a demonstration, I think in a march in support of the Polish judiciary a few years ago. I think there was an Irish member of the Supreme Court who also went there, and questions even were asked in Ireland about this, because this is the tension, maybe not geopolitical tension, but it's the tension between maintaining the independence of one's role and keeping within the lines, and then, you know, at what point do you move outside of that for a greater good? But then you might respond, well, who defines the greater good? I think, you know, I was talking with my colleagues yesterday evening, and we were talking about, you know, what makes an ombudsman's office work well, what makes an ombudsman's office successful, given that we have soft power and not, you know, executive power. People don't have to do what I ask them to do, but in general they do. And we concluded that it works if everybody agrees to play the game. And the game is, I'm independent, I'm effective, I do my work ethically and well. And the administration plays its game by respecting my legitimacy. So if one side of the equation is out of kilter, as we say, then problems arise. So take from that what you will.
Are there any other questions from the public? Maybe someone, the gentleman over here.
Hello. I wanted to ask you about one issue. Just recent months, European Commission issued new guidelines about how sanctions against Russia should be imposed in member states, where European Commission urged to confiscate any values coming from Russia, even when it comes to private belongings. And don't you find this is infringement of Article 17 of Chapter of Basic Fundamental Human Rights? And is it your office right place to start proceedings about this issue? And another question I wanted to ask about Polish judges. I also wanted to extend this question as in case of recent rulings of European Court of Justice, it was said clearly that judicial system is part of European Union. So is it make your office also allowed to start some proceedings according to judicial system in member states as part of European policy? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, in relation to the sanctions regime, I think, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, our only involvement is that, and that has been in relation to access to documents, I think, in relation to documents pertaining to the decision-making in relation to sanctions. So, I mean, we can share them with you. You can talk to us afterwards and whatever. The other part of your question is whether we can intervene at ECJ level. Is that it? Yeah. No, we don't. Sometimes we are asked to join as a what do you call a notice party? A what? To intervene. Pardon me? No. Do you want to reply to that? And this is Jennifer King, who's my legal expert. Go ahead, please. Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me, everybody? Just to reply to the question, the Ombudsman has no jurisdiction to and has no mandate, no authority to actually launch proceedings in that context. So we have a role in relation to the administrative activities, but we have no power to launch, initiate proceedings. So despite Emily's best attempts to try and bring justice, she cannot. She has no role in that regard. In relation to maybe the first aspect, which was just remind me of the first element of your question again. Yes. Well, sanctions are adopted by council decision. So our role would actually be in that context limited to complaints. If we receive complaints or if we feel there's actually a kind of a systemic issue, then we would maybe open an initiative inquiry. But you must also remember that rights under the Charter are not absolute, that there is provision in Article 52 of the Charter to limit or restrict the rights in circumstances that are provided by law that are proportionate. And so this is the legal basis for the adoption of sanctions in the first instance. So I think it has to be borne in mind, Article 52 of the Charter. So, but we can discuss after if you like.
Okay. Before the next question from the public, we have another question from ourselves to you, Mrs. Ombudsman. In those times when there's a big diversity, not only the cultural one, but also in legal tradition, in general legal systems in the EU member states, how does you as an European Ombudsman navigate and respect the differences while you try to enforce new laws and standards?
Well, we don't actually have to navigate the different member state laws. It's just EU law that we deal with. But I think where we do have to sort of navigate the different approaches to administration and different sensitivities in relation to administration. It comes more from when we try to influence change in certain areas. So therefore, typically in the EU, transparency is given a higher value in, let's say, the Scandinavian states, and not so high a value in other countries. And that's based on their own political and cultural and historical background. So it's trying to find that, it's trying to find a point at which people can coalesce around, but it's not the lowest common denominator. Also an issue around, obviously, data protection. We find that data protection is being increasingly used as a shield against transparency, and that's problematic as well. And there should be a lot more harmony between the two regimes. We also find differences in relation to ethical issues. For example, we've done a lot of work on what we call revolving doors. This is when typically, let's say, an EU Commission official who's been involved in a very interesting file, which is of interest to a particular industrial sector, moves into that sector. And so there are rules in relation to how they conduct themselves and protections that are there for the public interest, but they're not always followed. And then again, we find when we're trying to influence change and try and get the Commission to take a sort of a harder, proactive, more public interest stance in relation to this, we come across variations between the member states in relation to how they view it. For some people, it is, virtually forbidden that you would be allowed immediately to go into the private sector, having been involved in particular sensitive areas in the public arena. For others, it's just no big deal. And they wonder what the problem is, and doesn't everybody have a right to work? So it's sort of navigating those particular differences between the member states when we're trying to influence a particular change in the administration. But in relation to the law, we just have to deal with the EU law.
So are there any questions from the audience or perhaps online on our transmission? Okay.
Madam Ombudsman, I believe you must be aware of the newest movie by Agnieszka Holland, The Green Border. It's recently stirred up a great discussion in Poland regarding situation in Polish-Belarusian border. And do you believe that the allegations made by Holland regarding the possible violation of fundamental rights of migrants on Polish-Belarusian border might have happened or might be happening right now?
Well, I understand this is a very political issue in the middle of the election campaign, and I'm not going to get involved in it. But yes, I think, just reflecting over the last few days when we've been talking to Frontex and so on, and one idea that is sort of one thought that some people put forward is that, when it comes to the border protection, external border protection, which involves dealing with migrants, obviously, and asylum seekers, is that there should be a bit more EU and a bit less member state. At the moment, it's the member states exert a lot of control, even though, as I was reminded this morning, they are actually shared borders. So that's an issue. And I think in the context of the investigation we're doing into Frontex and the sinking of the Adriana and the huge loss of life, we will be exploring that, because my understanding that Frontex is not at the borders of Poland, has not been invited either. So, there's an area there that's worth exploring.
Okay, maybe now someone from the back has any questions. Okay, okay. So first we'll give the floor to you, and maybe then someone from the back, if anyone has questions.
Thank you, at last. First of all, I would like to thank you sincerely for this wonderful speech and express my admiration for the Ombudsman's activity. Secondly, I have heard it often said at universities in the United States that the state is in fact ruled by 9 judges, meaning, of course, judges of the Supreme Court of the United States, which I think is quite applicable to Europe. Europe is ruled by judges, but not only and not primarily by judges of the Supreme Courts, but also by judges of the Constitutional Courts, and the crown of such court is the Court of Justice of the European Union and also the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. There is also saying in German literature, die Expansion der Herrschaft der Richter, expansion of the power of the judges. So some say that above saying has the implication that judges are also ruled by law professors from law faculties. What do you think about this? And second question, very briefly, I asked this question our former ombudsman Adam Bodnar. We all know, and Professor Zawicka-Łojek will confirm, that Article 6, Section 2 of the Treaty on the European Union requires the European Union to accede to the European Convention on Human Rights. My question is therefore, why do you think the European Union has not yet acceded to the European ECHR in general, and what do you think of the judge's ruling, it is CJEU opinion 2/13, which said that the draft agreement on the accession of the European Union to the ECHR was incompatible with the treaty, where these judges, going back to the first question, also ruled by law professors in this case. Thank you.
Okay, there's a lot there. I suppose now it's time to confess that I'm not a lawyer. I think the one piece of your question I think I can answer and will answer is in relation to why the European Union hasn't acceded to the European Convention on Human Rights. I'm not saying I know, but I do know. I think there was a court case quite a while ago now. It must be 10 years ago. Or there was a ruling from the ECJ.
There was an opinion 2/13. There was an opinion of the Court of Justice.
Yes,
of the European Union.
and I do not know what has happened in the meantime. I do not know what negotiations are going on. Jennifer, are you aware? No. So it's gone silent. And again, something like that will only be. There may well be conversations and discussions and negotiations going on in the background. If there are, I'm not aware of them. But I suppose it's only when they come to public attention that this becomes an issue again. I mean, I think when the ECJ did make its ruling, when you say 2016?
It was in 2013.
Oh, 2013, yeah, 10 years ago. Everything
Yes.
happened 10 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a long time. I actually will look into it, but it's not something that necessarily comes across my desk. Thank you.
Does anyone on the back have a question?
Yeah, this
One person.
this boy right here, Michał, here. This.
Yeah, so I would also like to ask you about your opinion, because there is an ongoing discussion. There is this open letter about facial recognition surveillance, and I know that the European Parliament has signed, has agreed with the matter that it should not be. It should be controlled, because the problem is that there are questions if it can be adjusted with while respecting human rights, but there are countries that say that we need this system to bring more safety into our countries and to protect more citizens. So I'd like to ask you about your opinion in that matter.
Okay, I think you're talking again about the political tensions between protecting fundamental rights and then protecting citizens within member states. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I said in my address, the political tensions are there, and we see them emerge particularly at times of intense political activity when there are elections on, or when a particular high number of migrants attempt to reach European shores. And again, going back to my role is to constantly remind the institutions of what they are supposed to do that the laws hasn't changed, the Charter of Fundamental Rights hasn't changed. There may be another element to your question that I did not get, but I just understood it to be that tension. If you'd like to repeat it, please do. Just my hearing.
I'm more curious about like your thoughts on this subject. Do you think that surveillance is in fact breaking, like, it's not, it's breaking human rights, like the whole surveillance system connected with recognition of faces does not stand with European values in human rights.
Okay, did you understand that? Right, come, yeah. No, Jennifer, do you want to just explain what he was saying? Because I didn't quite get it. Excuse me, it's just my hearing's terrible as well. Speak up. Oh, okay. Okay, so. Oh yeah, okay. So artificial intelligence. Okay, sorry, it's my hearing as well, and yeah, artificial intelligence you are talking about, and that is one of the issues that we're going to be dealing with when we have our European Network of Ombudsman conference in November. We've done a lot of provisional work on this. We're looking to see what the administration is doing, how it intends to use artificial intelligence, and the Commission is coming out with a lot of papers and advice in relation to that as well. And I think the piece that is of particular interest to us or to other ombudsmen is the accountability piece, because when you have human beings making decisions, they may be flawed, but at least we can track them and question the decision maker. But when you have algorithms doing it, or when you have all strange forms of artificial intelligence doing that in relation to so many areas that are vital to our daily lives, then issues arise. And I mean, some ombudsmen in the member states, I remember the Dutch ombudsman dealing with a case a few years ago in which, you know, decisions had been made through those sort of means which had impacted very negatively on a large swathe of people. So it's something we need to be aware of. But I think the main problem is that public administrations are sometimes by definition slow, and technology is incredibly fast. So while everybody in Brussels is deciding, you know, how can we regulate it and how can we best implement it in our public administration systems, at every point that they reach, the technology has outstripped it. So I think there has to be a huge reflection on how we organize our public administrations, and also how we train administrators in relation to this, because otherwise we are all going to be captured by global technology, you know, companies, rather than by the people who are charged with guiding us and making rules for our lives.
So we have one question that was raised online because we have a transmission going on. So I'm going just to read it out loud to you. It is, you have said that fundamental rights can be limited in certain circumstances. Is the example of border crisis one of these circumstances, and to what extent we can limit fundamental rights in this case? I assume the question is about the Polish-Belarusian and border crisis, but it's not precise here, so.
So the question precisely is?
In what circumstances can fundamental human rights be limited?
Well, obviously the fundamental rights are firstly protected by the member state itself, following its national law, and also following EU law and any international conventions that apply to it. Of course, then you have the EU dimension, and I was just saying in relation to another question there, you have the tension between the extent to which the member states impose their will and what role the EU has in relation to it. So, I mean, if you see, and I'm not talking about this particular issue, but if you see that fundamental rights are being abused in a member state, then obviously the member states have their own particular obligations, and but if they are not rising to them, then at what point does the EU get involved? And so if you take the situation that we're investigating now with Frontex and the deaths of all of those people, what we're trying to find out is to sort of track the accountability matrix, if you like. How was Frontex involved? To what extent was the EU involved? The Greek authorities and so on. I can't look at what the Greek authorities are doing, but the Greek Ombudsman is doing that. And so if we find that there is a gap somehow there, then the question to be posed to the EU agencies and administration generally, do you need to be a bit more assertive in relation to this? For example, at the moment, Frontex can act in member states only on their invitation. But as has been pointed out to us, I mean, the borders, the EU has a competence on the borders as well. So, it's a question for the EU whether it sits back and allows certain things to happen or whether it steps up. And we'll see what happens over the next weeks and months.
Okay. We have a question now, which might be not really political, but somehow is, because I know that English is not a flexive language, and you have similar words to describe men and women, but nowadays it's a discussion raised in maybe countries such as Poland and different countries where the languages are more flexive and give the possibility to differently name women and men on the same in the same institutions, having same professions. And I'd like to ask you, what do you think? What is your opinion on making the name ombudsman a different version of ombudsman for women, like maybe not ombudswomen, but something similar in other languages? And what do you think generally about the feminatives in languages?
Okay, well, I think that the question I'm most often asked, and was for the last 20 years as an ombudsman, either in Ireland or the EU, is why are you ombudsman and not ombudswoman? I have to blame the people of Sweden because they invented it. And they've always insisted that man means everybody. But then why, when there's more than one ombudsman in a room, are we called ombudsmen? When you think the ombud would change and not the man piece. Yeah, I mean, I go by ombudswoman, obviously, but in the treaties it's ombudsman. So I'm not sure that the EU is ready to have a treaty change just to change the name of the ombudsman to ombudswoman or ombud or whatever. In the United States, they call this particular official an ombud, which I think is a horrible title, and I don't want it. In France, it's mediatrice. In Spain, it's defensora del pueblo. In German, Gundi, please, it is Ombudsfrau. Yes. Yeah, but I think there is a recognition that ombudsman is whatever the Swedes intended at the time. It is rather old-fashioned and behind the times. But I remember when I was asked that question back in 2003, when I was elected as Irish ombudsman, and I was asked by a journalist, "Well, will you call yourself ombudsman or ombudswoman?" And I said, "I don't mind either." And I think the entire Swedish community of Ireland wrote into the Irish Times newspaper to complain about my lack of knowledge of the Swedish language. But I think, yeah, nowadays it seems, I think every venue I go to, somebody asks me this question, but it's in the treaties.
All right. Are there any other questions from the audience? Oh, over here.
I have a more general questions, not regarding the current affairs. And the question is, what advice or message do you have for young people and regarding human rights, the perseverance of them, how to defend them, and how to remain assertive as European youth?
Well, it's very simple. Be active, you know. And also, you know, the fallout of human rights breaches, the fallout of the climate change that we're experiencing is going to be impacting far more on your generation than mine. And therefore you have not just an ethical obligation to get involved in those issues, but also a very personal need, I would have thought, to get involved. I mean, universities tend to be places where there is great idealism, and where there is a lot of action and activity, and I would encourage that. I would also, on another level, because the EU is still strong in fundamental rights, no matter what I've said, I mean, they are still very strong, and more so than a lot of perhaps, individual countries around the world and so on. And so I would also encourage you to look to your careers in the future in the EU, in the EU administration. There are wonderful positions available for young people like you. We have a number of Polish people, excellent colleagues in our office, and we greatly appreciate them, mainly because they recommended some rather good restaurants to us this week. And yeah, I mean, I see it now. I mean, I have 5 adult children and I'm watching their careers develop. I've tried in vain to persuade any of them to go to the EU administration, so I'll try you lot instead. But yeah, think about that. I think you have to I think you have to make ethical choices in relation to your careers as well, to your profession, because I think the world is always challenged, but I think it is particularly challenged now, and those challenges are going to impact mostly on your generation and then your children and grandchildren, and that is why you really need to rise above, the politics of the day and look to the far horizon and what you should be doing to make that a wonderful one.
Thank you so much.
And now we'd like another question from the public. Are there any questions? Okay. So I'll give you time to think of another ones because I'm sure you have more. And now I have a question because on some of our questions you've mentioned that there are no certain competencies that the EU Ombudsman might have on such issue. And do you generally think that your role as an Ombudsman is inadequately limited to some certain things and you don't have as an Ombudsman enough competence to protect fundamental rights you've been mentioning? Or is that enough and you think that everything is fine with the amount of competences you have?
Yeah, well, I mean, the people sometimes ask me if I need more power, if I should be able to make binding decisions. But if I were able to make binding decisions, I wouldn't be an ombudsman. I mean, you have the court to make binding decisions. The ombudsman works sort of in the wider area, I think, of justice and fairness and so on. And I think the day that it is decided to give the European Ombudsman more powers is the day when the administration will have proved itself to be a very poor one. Because I go back to what I said earlier, an ombudsman works when everybody agrees to play the game, when I work independently, ethically and well, and when the administration does the same. And I think there usually calls for greater powers to be given to ombudsmen and similar institutions when there's something very wrong in the body politic or there's something very wrong in the administration. So again, I mean, about roughly 80 to 85% of my recommendations and suggestions are accepted. That seems like a high figure, but I actually think it should be 100%. Not that I think we're so brilliant, but because I think unless our decisions are completely wayward or illegal, I think they should be accepted. And that is for the good of the system. It is the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the office of the Ombudsman as the watchdog on behalf of the people of the public over the public administration. So, for example, in Finland, they do have a slightly different system, but it would be, sort of breaking news if a recommendation from the Finnish Ombudsman was not accepted. I mean, because that is the culture they have, and it's the same in certain other countries. Whereas in countries where the rule of law is weak or poor, then you have a lower acceptance rate. So my ambition, I don't have that long left in this role, but my ambition would always be to raise the game, not of our office, because I think we do play to a high standard, but of the administration itself. So I think when I go and meet other ombudsmen from around the world and I hear that they have very strong powers, I think, well, there's probably a problem with the administration if that amount of powers have been given to you.
All right, any other questions? Oh, there was one question out there.
Thank you very much for a great lecture. We really appreciate. As you can see, there are plenty of students interested in EU law, and they are really happy to extend their knowledge in a practical sense. And can you recommend them any kind of traineeship or vacation placement, or how they should prepare themselves for working in EU institutions? Thank you very much.
Pardon me? In the EU generally? Yeah, I mean, we take in trainees twice a year, isn't it? And they stay for a full year, and they're paid. And we make sure that other trainees get paid as well, which is important, because we had a case a few years ago where a trainee with the European External Action Service, the Foreign Affairs part of the EU, complained that trainees there did not get paid. And not only did they not get paid, they got no money for travel, for meals or anything, which meant that if your parents or whatever, you yourself had a lot of money, you could take up the traineeship, but if you didn't have those resources, you couldn't. So it was you know, privilege following privilege. And we found that there was no law against it as such, but we found that it was against the anti-discrimination clauses in the European treaties, and we use that, the high law, the high values, to make our case. And as a result of that, trainees in the EEAS are now paid. The traineeships, I'm sure your professors and everyone will let you know when they're available. It's highly competitive. Obviously, and so it should be, because the rewards are great. But I mean, I think if you start investigating early enough, you'll have a good chance. And even getting anything in Brussels can be, you know, very valuable. And our trainees, I think they have a very good experience, because they're there for a year. They're not there for a short period, and they immediately get involved in the files. It's not that they're sent off to make coffee or whatever. I mean, they immediately get involved, and they have a very, very rich experience. And then we keep some of them at the end. There's a competition, and we keep some of them on contract. So if any of you are interested in EU administration, EU law, politics, then I think you should look out for those traineeships.
All right, so now is the moment for our last question, or a couple of last questions actually, because we're slowly coming to an end. So did anyone else have a question? If not, I have a question, because as we know, you are an ex-journalist, and you've been actively working as a journalist. So could you perhaps tell us how far did this career help you as an ombudsman? And do you have any particular advice for journalists especially who are under attack of the authorities, such as those in Poland, for example?
Sorry, could you say that again? Do I have
any advice for journalists who are under pressure and attacks from political authorities? And also, could you tell us a bit more about your career?
I mean, in a general way, in relation to the EU, again, I know some institutional leaders are very strong on that, and the freedom of the press. And I know, in particular, I think the Parliament President, Roberta Metsola, is particularly strong on that. I mean, it's just a case, again, of, you know, making this issue high in public consciousness, getting a coalition of forces around it to challenge it. Individual journalists can be very isolated and so on. Even their media organizations can be very isolated. So you need to look for support wherever you can. And I am aware, because obviously I tune into what the EU is doing, the Parliament, the Council and all of that, that it is given quite a high priority. And perhaps, you know, there should be perhaps more action at that level.
Dobrze. Teraz, okay. Now it will be time for the last question from our colleague. Give him a microphone, please, and that will be the last question.
Hello, Paweł Piwovar from the Alumni Association. I have a question from very different field. You are alumni of 2 universities, 3 faculties, and I would like to ask you for your advice for these brilliant young people, how to create such a great career as you made.
Stop doing law immediately. No, God, I don't know. I mean, yeah. So I've spent 20 years, more than 20 years, as a journalist, and now 20 years in Ombudsman. I started very, very young. I want you to know that. I think what they say follow your passion. It's great, but sometimes we need to earn money as well as following our passion. But I think, I mean, I think I've been very fortunate in that the things that I was interested in as a small child are the things that have that still concern me as an ombudsman. As a small child, I was really interested in politics and current affairs. I remember, writing about an American election back in, I don't know, 1968, probably when your grandparents were born. I remember and my parents were also very interested. So I never got involved in politics ever. I mean, obviously I vote in certain ways, but I've never publicly supported any political party. So then, I was I was a very curious child, bit of a magpie mind, interested in lots of things. I got into journalism, then into political journalism, and then I became an ombudsman. And people said, well, isn't that a very different job? And actually, it isn't really, because you're still in that same space. You're in between the people and the administration. And so even though I had to be a little more careful in what I said or what I wrote, I mean, you're still dealing with the stuff of people's lives, and you're still dealing with an interface between those who govern and the people who are governed. And I think I learned a lot of lessons in relation to that, which I brought with me into the European Ombudsman's job during the financial crisis in Ireland. And we had gone through a period, as I know Poland has done, it was called the Celtic Tiger, when we were rich for the first time ever in our lives, and we reveled in it. And then the financial crisis hit and people were absolutely devastated. And it wasn't just that they lost their money or their jobs, they lost their lives as well. People committed suicide, people took their own lives because they could not cope. And then I watched how our government managed that. And of course we had what was called the Troika in, basically, the Commission and I think the IMF and who's the other one? The ECB, whatever, anyway, 3 of them came in to run our country for us, which was humiliating on one level, though a lot of people were delighted that there were adults in charge at long last. But what I was interested in was the communication between the government and the people, because to a certain degree the government tried to hide what was happening. I mean, benefits were being cut back and people couldn't understand what was happening, and the government was not being honest with people about what was happening and what they were going to have to put up with. They were still trying to put a gloss, if you like, make it seem better than it actually was. And I remember there was an issue with medical cards, which is when people get free access to medical care, which is highly important, especially for people who'd lost their jobs or their income. And suddenly they weren't getting the same money. And the government said, well, nothing has changed. But one thing had changed, and that was the discretionary power that local authorities had, government had, in relation to giving out money for particular medical treatments. So the government, on the one hand, saying nothing had changed, and legally nothing had changed, but they were using their discretion differently. And so it taught me a lot about the proper relationship that there should be between an administration and a people. And the 2 main things: good communication and honesty. Honesty. People can accept so much if they know they're being told the truth. But if they're not being told the truth, that's where the stress comes in. And communication is huge, and I emphasize it a lot in my office, because we all know the frustrations we have with service providers or whatever when we feel we're not being listened to, we're not being heard. So, I mean, I think looking back at those days, very dark days in Ireland, I think, the government, did a lot that was good and did what the Troika told it to, and eventually we emerged out from under it. But I think a lot of stress could have been saved if they had been a bit clearer about the hardships that people were going to have to face. And again, going back to migration and the EU doing certain things or not doing certain things for particular reasons, just be honest with the people. But in relation to a career, look, if there is something that you're really interested in, well, then just follow it. And even though I'm not a lawyer, I can see the value of a law degree and an economics degree as well. I mean, they are the foundational studies. But, you know, if you are if you are committed enough and dedicated enough, you know, you will succeed and keep at it. Lots of people try to get into EU jobs or EU traineeships year after year after year. Eventually they can't succeed. So, you know, this sounds a bit perhaps over the top or a bit dramatic, but it is your generation that is going to be charged with solving all of the major issues that is facing the globe now, and particularly the climate crisis. And so we older people are relying on you guys to step up to the mark, and your choice of career will dictate a lot of that.
Okay, the whole our time has passed out. That's very sad, but I would like to thank you again, especially for your speech and for this Q&A, for answering all those questions with a complex and thoughtful answers of yours, and for touching and covering a lot of important issues. Now, from on behalf of the faculty, on behalf of the our Students Association and the Alumni Association, we'd like to thank you with the special gifts we have prepared from you. So I'd like to welcome Paweł Piwowar, who is the Vice President of the Alumni Association, who will give you your present.
Madam Ombudsman, it's a great pleasure for us that we can host you here at Law Faculty of Warsaw University. Our president of our association is also a very strong and great woman as you. Sorry, something connecting you, because both of you were the first women on these positions. Because the president of Alumni Association is Professor Małgorzata Gersdorf, who was the first Supreme Court chief woman in Poland and also in European Union. So it's a great pleasure that such a strong and great women are in these positions, and we can connecting this together, and we could cooperate with this great lecture. Thank you very much.
We also have another gift for you from the whole University of Warsaw. These are the gifts prepared by our Dean's office. Okay, thank you all for coming, and thanks for participating, thanks for all the questions again, and that will be the end. Thank you. Goodbye.